Memphis, early 1970s. The concert hall trembled with anticipation. Hundreds of fans pressed forward in their seats, waiting for the man they called a king. Lights blazed, the orchestra tuned, and the air itself seemed charged. Yet amid the glitter and excitement, Elvis Presley felt something colder. A chill that reached back decades. There, in the second row, sat a face he could never forget. Older now, lined with time, but unmistakable. His former music teacher, the one who had leaned over a trembling boy in a classroom years earlier and delivered a sentence that cut deeper than any blade. "Forget about music. You have no talent tonight." Teacher and student faced each other again. But the stage was no schoolroom. Elvis stood before thousands, adorned in rhinestones, crowned by fame. And yet, inside, the boy from Tupelo stirred uneasily. The laughter, the shame, the sting of dismissal, it all came rushing back. The hall thundered with applause, but for Elvis, only one pair of eyes mattered. Past and present collided in that electric instant. The legend was about to answer the wound of his childhood. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with something far more shocking. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The house on Old Saltillo Road looked less like a home and more like something the wind could easily tear apart. One wooden room, boards nailed together in haste, walls so thin that winter seemed to crawl right through them. The Presleys had built it with their own hands when Vernon managed to scrape together just enough money and favors. Inside, the floor creaked with every step, and the few pieces of furniture were worn smooth by time and by need. The refrigerator in the corner stood nearly empty most of the time. Milk when they were lucky, a half loaf of bread, sometimes nothing at all. A dented tin can of beans could last 2 meals if Gladys stretched it right. Clothes were mended until the fabric itself seemed tired of holding together. Young Elvis's shirts were patched so often they looked more like quilts. Shoes, when they existed, were always second-hand. Tupelo, Mississippi in the 1940s was a hard place to be poor. Work was scarce, and for families like the Presleys, every penny mattered. But for Elvis, what mattered most was something different. An old, cheap guitar, its wood dulled by time, the strings loose, the sound uneven. It wasn't much, but it was his. One morning, sunlight slanted weakly through the schoolhouse windows. The teacher tapped her ruler on the desk, calling for quiet. It was music lesson day, though few of the children cared. They were restless, shifting in their benches, more concerned with lunch or the long walk home than with notes on a page. The teacher, a woman with a stern face and tired eyes, looked toward the thin boy in the back. His hair was combed carefully, though it wouldn't stay flat, and his shirt hung loose on his frame. "Elvis," she said, almost impatiently, "why don't you bring that guitar up here? Show us what you've been working on." There was a murmur of whispers, half amusement, half anticipation. Elvis stood slowly, clutching the guitar to his chest as if afraid someone might snatch it away. His palms were damp. He wasn't used to being watched. Not like this. At home, he sang for his mama, who smiled and hummed along. Here, though, the room felt sharp, like a place where laughter could cut. He perched awkwardly on the edge of a chair at the front of the class. The guitar slipped against his knee. His fingers trembled as they found the first chord. For a moment, he almost stopped. But then he remembered the way Gladys's eyes lit up when he played, the way her tired shoulders seemed to ease. He wanted to give her that, even if no one else cared. The song was simple, just a folk tune he'd heard in church. His voice came soft, higher than he wished, thin against the wooden walls. He sang anyway, eyes lowered, focusing on the strings so he wouldn't have to see their faces. At first there was silence, then a few giggles, muffled but sharp. Someone whispered. Another boy made an exaggerated sigh, earning quiet chuckles. The teacher's mouth twisted, not in admiration, but in judgment. When the song ended, the room offered no applause, just the scrape of a chair and the rustle of paper. The teacher spoke, her tone final, almost dismissive. "Elvis, your voice is weak. You don't have a future in music. Best you find something serious to do with your time." The words struck harder than any blow. He felt the heat rising in his face, the sting of humiliation. His throat tightened, but he nodded quickly, wanting only to sit down, to vanish into the desk. The children smirked. To them, it was nothing more than a moment of entertainment, a chance to laugh. For him, it was something that would not fade. That afternoon, he walked home slowly, guitar hanging heavy in his hand. Each step seemed harder than the last. The dirt road stretched long, the sun beating down, cicadas buzzing in the trees. He replayed the teacher's words again and again. No future in music. They weren't just words. They were a verdict, a sentence passed down in front of everyone. When he reached the little house, Gladys was on the porch, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes searching his face the way only a mother's can. She saw the slump in his shoulders before he spoke. "What happened, baby?" He hesitated, then told her in halting words. The guitar, the song, the laughter, the teacher's verdict. When he finished, he looked away, ashamed, as if repeating it made it more true. Gladys rose and pulled him close, pressing his head against her chest. She smelled faintly of soap and worn cotton, the comforting scent of home. "Don't you listen to them," she said firmly, her voice low but steady. "You are special, Elvis. God gave you something. They can't hear it yet, but I do. I hear it every time you sing, he wanted to believe her." But the sting lingered, carved deep. In that moment, the seed was planted. The desire not just to sing, but to prove that he was more than a poor boy in patched clothes, more than someone to laugh at. He would remember the way that classroom felt, the heat, the silence, the smirks. He would remember the teacher's words, and they would burn inside him, not as defeat, but as fuel. That night, after supper, he sat on the front steps with his guitar. The sky stretched wide and dark above Tupelo, stars sharp against the black. He strummed softly, the sound carrying into the stillness. His fingers found the same chords, but this time his voice came stronger, steadier. Gladys sat inside, listening, smiling to herself. The boy who had been told he had no future in music sang into the night, unaware that those painful words would become the fire that shaped his destiny. Memphis, in the early 1950s, was a city humming with contradictions. The neon of Beale Street flickered against crumbling brick buildings, and music seeped from every doorway. Blues, gospel, country, it all blended into something restless, something that didn't fit inside neat categories. To a young man like Elvis Presley, recently moved with his family from Tupelo, the city felt like both a maze and a promise. By day, he worked odd jobs, truck driving, moving supplies, whatever kept a little money coming into the Presley household. By night, though, he lingered near the clubs where black musicians played, absorbing every rhythm, every shout of the saxophone, every sliding guitar lick. He stood outside the open doors, watching, listening, wishing. It was a different kind of education, one no schoolteacher could grade. Sun Records sat on Union Avenue, a modest studio that seemed almost ordinary from the street. Inside, though, Sam Phillips was searching for something new, a voice that could bridge the sounds of the South and make them explode beyond Memphis. Elvis walked through that door in 1953, nervous, clutching a few dollars. He only wanted to make a record for his mother, a simple gift. But when Sam heard the boy's voice, uncertain as it was, he recognized a spark. Months later, late one night, everything changed. With guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black, Elvis fumbled through songs, restless, nothing working. Then, almost as a joke, he launched into "That's All Right," a blues tune he twisted with a rhythm and energy no one expected. Sam Phillips's head snapped up. The tape machine rolled. Something electric filled the room. Within days, radio stations in Memphis spun the record. Listeners leaned closer to their sets, puzzled yet thrilled. Was the singer black or white? Was this country or was it blues? It didn't matter. It was alive. Across town, in a shabby living room, a group of former classmates huddled around a radio. The signal crackled, but the voice cut through. They looked at each other, wide-eyed. Wait a second. That's Elvis Presley. From school. The quiet one with the funny hair disbelief mixed with nervous laughter. The boy they'd teased, the one told he had no future in music, was now blasting through speakers across the South. The realization stunned them. But as quickly as excitement rose, so did backlash. Local newspapers called the sound dangerous. Ministers warned parents to keep their children away. Headlines used words like immoral and indecent. It was too much rhythm, too much energy, too much shaking of what was supposed to stay still. Elvis, barely out of his teens, suddenly found himself accused not just of breaking rules, but of threatening the very order of things. He stood backstage before one of his first concerts, tugging at the sleeves of his cheap jacket. The hall was packed with teenagers buzzing with anticipation, but he couldn't shake the voice in his head. The one from years ago in Tupelo, the teacher declaring he had no talent. Now the stakes were higher. If he failed here, he would fail not just in front of classmates, but in front of the entire city. When he stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted. At first his hands trembled. He gripped the microphone too tightly, as if it might slip away. Scotty and Bill struck the first chords. Then Elvis began to move, awkward at first, then freer, hips rolling, knees shaking. The sound of girls screaming drowned out his own uncertainty. Something wild had been unleashed, something even he didn't fully understand. Afterward, drenched in sweat, he stood in the wings, heart pounding. The applause still echoed, but in the quiet moments, the teacher's words returned like a ghost. Your voice is weak. You have no future in music. The cheers of hundreds couldn't erase the sting of one sentence. Still, he kept going. The shows grew bigger. The records sold faster. Every jukebox in Memphis seemed to spin, "That's All Right." But the noise of success never fully silenced the memory of that classroom. He carried it like a scar, hidden beneath the glitter and the sound. Walking through Beale Street one night, Elvis paused outside a club where a bluesman played a slow, aching tune. He stood in the shadows, listening. The crowd inside swayed, oblivious to the young man watching from the sidewalk. In that moment, he felt both proud and unsettled. Proud that his voice was now part of this great, unruly music. Unsettled because deep inside, he still feared being unworthy of it. The boy from Tupelo was becoming someone new. An artist who could make a room shake, who could turn ridicule into rhythm. Yet the echo of the past refused to fade. It drove him harder. made every performance not just a show, but a battle. And though the world was beginning to call him a star, Elvis Presley still heard the teacher's verdict in the quiet after the applause. The Las Vegas showroom pulsed with light. Chandeliers spilled golden fire across the room, and smoke from endless cigarettes curled lazily toward the ceiling. Dealers and cocktail waitresses slipped between tables, their trays glittering with glasses. It was the early 1970s, and Elvis Presley was no longer just the boy from Tupelo or the rising star of Memphis radio. He was a phenomenon, headlining with sold-out crowds night after night. His jumpsuits shimmered like armor under the spotlights, each rhinestone catching the gaze of the hungry audience. But on this particular night, there was a shift in the air, something he felt before the curtain even lifted. Word had reached him quietly, passed by a friend who'd spotted a familiar face in the audience. She was older now, her hair streaked with silver, her shoulders bent slightly with age. The music teacher from Tupelo had taken a seat in the second section, not far from the stage. She hadn't sought attention. She had bought her ticket like anyone else, sitting quietly among the gamblers and tourists. When Elvis heard, his first reaction was not anger, but something stranger. A tightness in his chest, a flicker of the old boy he once was. He laughed lightly, brushing it off in front of the band, but the laugh was too sharp, almost brittle. Alone, he found himself staring at the dressing room mirror, the reflection not of a legend, but of a boy, with patched clothes and shaking hands on a schoolhouse guitar. The orchestra struck its opening notes, pulling him back to the present. The stage awaited. As he stepped into the lights, the familiar roar greeted him. Women screaming, men cheering, the crash of applause like thunder rolling across the desert. He smiled, raised a hand, and launched into the first number. Yet, behind the smile, his thoughts narrowed to a single face somewhere in the crowd. Midway through the set, while the band shifted between songs, he made a decision. Instead of the next planned hit, he signaled to Scotty for a different key. Confusion flickered across the musicians, but they followed his lead. The opening chords were slower, older, a song almost no one in the room would recognize. It was the very tune he had sung timidly in that Tupelo classroom years earlier, the one that had drawn laughter instead of applause. The audience, accustomed to the pounding energy of Suspicious Minds or the glittering power of Burning Love, quieted. Conversations hushed. The casino's usual restlessness gave way to stillness as Elvis leaned into the microphone, his voice lower now, steady, rich with decades of living. He sang not for fame, not for the screaming fans, but for one listener. His eyes searched the crowd until they found her, a solitary figure in a sea of faces. The moment was electric, though no pyrotechnics flashed, no dancers moved. The power came from contrast. The frenzy of the Las Vegas showroom pressed against the quiet gravity of a man revisiting his earliest wound. He could almost feel the wooden desk beneath his boyhood fingers, hear the scratch of pencils, the faint giggle of classmates. But instead of shame, this time the song carried strength, a declaration that the judgment once passed upon him no longer held sway. As he sang, he noticed her reaction. At first, she sat very still, her expression unreadable. Then her hands folded tighter in her lap, her shoulders drawing in. Perhaps she recognized the tune. Perhaps not, but she could not avoid the weight of his gaze, directed at her through the bright wash of the spotlight. The crowd, sensing something intimate was unfolding, leaned in. The usual carnival of a Vegas show gave way to a hush so deep that the clinking of glasses at the bar seemed almost intrusive. People looked around, puzzled, asking silently, "What is this? Why this song?" For Elvis, the performance was not spectacle, but reckoning. He wasn't interested in exposing her, nor in humiliating. It was never about revenge. Instead, it was about proving something inward, closing the loop that had haunted him for decades. He needed her to hear it, not because he required her approval, but because the boy inside him deserved to stand before her one last time, unafraid. The final notes hung in the air, trembling and raw. The applause began hesitantly, then grew. Fans who didn't know the backstory still sensed they had witnessed something unusual, something unplanned. The cheers rose, but Elvis didn't bask in them. His eyes remained fixed for a beat longer on that one figure in the crowd. To the audience, it was just another performance colored with mystery. To him, it was a conversation across time, between a boy who had been dismissed and a man who had carved his place in history. As the band shifted into the next number and the crowd roared again, Elvis exhaled. Outwardly, he was still the king of rock and roll, the rhinestone hero under the lights. But inside, for those brief minutes, he had been that trembling boy once more. And this time, he had sung without fear. The dressing room smelled of cologne and sweat, a mix of glamour and exhaustion. Garments hung from racks in dazzling rows, white jumpsuits stitched with gold, capes heavy with rhinestones. On the counter, a dozen rings and chains caught the yellow glow of the bulbs that circled the mirror. But Elvis sat quietly in his chair, staring at his own reflection, as if it might reveal something he didn't want to face. A knock on the door broke the stillness. One of the band members stepped in, his voice carrying both amusement and gravity. "She's here, man." Second row, just like they said. Elvis let out a short laugh, almost casual, but the corners of his mouth tightened. He turned back to the mirror, brushing a hand over his hair. "Is that so?" he murmured. The words sounded light, but his chest felt heavy. As the door closed again, silence filled the room except for the faint hum of the orchestra warming up beyond the curtain. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and memories began to surface. Uninvited, vivid. He could see the schoolroom as if it were yesterday. Wooden desks lined in neat rows, chalk dust drifting in the air. He remembered how self-conscious he'd felt about his accent, how the other boys mocked his hair, slicked with grease his mama had bought cheap from the corner store. He remembered the sting of their laughter when he strummed his battered guitar, the hot shame of being told his voice had no worth. That voice came back to him now, not muffled, but sharp, as if the teacher still stood at his side whispering judgment into his ear. For a man adored by millions, the memory of that dismissal carried surprising weight. Success had not erased it. Fame had not silenced it. Instead, it lived within him, a reminder that no stage, no ovation could fully heal a childhood wound. He reached for a glass of water, his hand unsteady. Across the room, his bodyguard leaned against the wall, arms folded. The man, who had faced countless crowds and protected Elvis from chaos, now added something quietly. "She said she came tonight to see if you really have talent." The words landed harder than expected. Elvis froze, water untouched, staring at the floor. For a moment, he wasn't the icon preparing to conquer another Vegas crowd. He was a boy again, barefoot on the dusty roads of Tupelo, clutching a guitar too big for his hands. The orchestra's sound swelled louder, signaling that the show was minutes away. Applause leaked through the walls, faint but insistent, like a tide he couldn't hold back. Yet his mind refused to stay in the present. Images collided, patched shirts, empty refrigerators, long walks home under the Mississippi sun. He remembered the way his mama had pulled him close that day, whispering that he was special. And now, decades later, the same woman who had once reduced him to silence sat waiting in the second row, ready to judge again. Elvis rose from the chair, pacing. His cape brushed the floor, heavy on his shoulders. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself the years of records, the tours, the screaming crowds were proof enough. But another voice, softer, private, admitted the truth. He wanted her to see. He wanted her to know she'd been wrong. Not for his pride, but for that boy she had dismissed. In the hallway, a stagehand called, "5 minutes!" The door opened, and sound burst in. The tuning of trumpets, the shuffle of feet, the swelling excitement of 1,000 people filling their seats. Elvis squared his shoulders, but his heart beat too fast, too uneven. He caught his own reflection one last time in the mirror. The rhinestones glowed, the hair perfect, the jaw set with determination. The world saw a legend, a king. But behind the glitter, the boy still lingered, uncertain, waiting to be tested once more. The stage awaited. The curtain was about to rise, and for the first time in years, Elvis Presley felt less like an untouchable star and more like a child bracing for a teacher's verdict. The moment the curtain rose, the crowd erupted like a storm breaking across the desert. The showroom glittered in anticipation. Hundreds of faces turned toward the stage, their cheers colliding into a wall of sound. Elvis stepped into the lights, the white of his jumpsuit blazing beneath the spotlights, the cape unfurling behind him like wings. From the outside, it looked like triumph, the king arriving to claim his throne. Yet inside, a chill pressed against his ribs. The band struck the opening notes of the set, the brass sharp, the guitars driving. He moved with the rhythm, hips snapping, knees bending, gestures practiced and yet still alive. The crowd screamed louder, some standing on chairs, some reaching for him with outstretched hands. But though the noise filled the hall, Elvis heard something else, the silence of memory, the weight of eyes from the second row. Halfway through the second song, he paused. The band, trained to follow his every move, eased to a halt. The crowd's roar dimmed into confusion. Elvis held the microphone close, his breathing loud in the stillness. He looked over the sea of faces, past the sequins, the hairspray, the glint of cocktail glasses. "There's someone here tonight," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "Someone who once told me I ought to quit singing, that I didn't have a future in music." A ripple moved through the room, gasps, whispers, heads turning, trying to spot the mystery figure. The statement landed like a stone dropped in still water, spreading rings of tension outward. He did not name her. He didn't need to. The audience leaned forward, electrified by the sudden intimacy. For once, the showman's mask slipped, and behind it was a man revisiting his deepest wound. Instead of returning to the familiar hits, he gestured to the band. Scotty looked startled, but obeyed. The chords that followed were slow, halting. Not the kind of music Vegas expected. Elvis began to sing the same schoolroom hymn he had stumbled through as a boy. His voice now carried decades of life, richer, weathered, filled with a resonance no child could muster. The room shifted. The screams of fans died away. Even the clinking of glasses ceased. 1,000 people sat motionless, listening to a song that felt less like performance and more like confession. Elvis gripped the microphone with both hands, his knuckles white. He poured the memory of that afternoon in Tupelo into every note. The laughter, the judgment, the humiliation. Yet instead of breaking under it, he reshaped it. forging sound from pain. Each phrase was a declaration, not to boast, but to prove, quietly, that the boy had not been defeated. Spotlights carved his figure in sharp relief. The rhinestones glittered like stars, but the man beneath them looked vulnerable, stripped of the invincible glamour his fans expected. He wasn't moving now, wasn't shaking his hips or dazzling with theatrics. He was simply standing, singing, as if on trial, before the very people who had once doubted him. The silence of the crowd became its own kind of verdict. They listened with rapt attention, many with hands pressed to their mouths. Some shifted uncomfortably, as though intruding on a private moment. Others leaned closer, drawn by the rawness in his tone. When the last note fell into stillness, Elvis did not bow. He lowered his head slightly, eyes closed, breathing uneven. For a heartbeat, the hall remained utterly quiet. A pause so thick that even the hum of the amplifiers seemed loud. Then, slowly, the applause began. Not the usual explosion of screams, but something deeper, steady, reverent clapping that grew into a thunderous ovation. Yet Elvis did not bask in it. He kept his gaze on the second row, on the place where memory and present collided. He had turned the stage into a courtroom, and tonight he had delivered his testimony. To the world, it was spectacle. To him, it was reckoning. The last note still lingered when the first tear appeared. It wasn't on stage. It came from the audience. A woman in the third row pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Then another. The sound of soft sobbing rippled faintly through the silence. The song Elvis had chosen, stripped bare, unadorned, had done something his usual spectacle never could. It had opened wounds not only his own, but those buried in others. He lowered the microphone slowly, the chain around his neck catching the light. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, as though the song had taken more strength than the roaring numbers ever did. For a moment, he seemed unsure of what to say. Then, into the hushed air, he spoke, his drawl low, almost confessional. I carried those words with me for a long time. Longer than I should have, but maybe without them, I wouldn't have fought so hard. Maybe I wouldn't be standing here tonight. The sentence did not come as an accusation. It came as an acknowledgement that even pain could become fuel, that even cruelty could be reshaped into something meaningful. His voice caught briefly, a flicker of rawness breaking through the polished performer's mask. In the second row, the teacher sat rigid, hands knotted together in her lap. At first, her face was impassive, armored by years of habit. But the wall cracked slowly. She blinked, then blinked again, and finally, her composure gave way. Tears welled, slipping down cheeks that once carried authority, now softened by remorse. She reached for her purse, fumbling for a tissue, but her hands shook. The audience noticed. Heads turned, whispers spread, then faded into silence again. For once, the spotlight wasn't on Elvis alone. It was on the invisible bond. The thread stretched across decades between the man on stage and the woman who had once dismissed him. Elvis watched her, though he never called her name. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was not triumphant, not vengeful. It was calm, almost grateful, as if he were laying down a burden he'd carried too long. Then the applause began. Not wild screaming this time, but something heavier, almost reverent. People rose to their feet, clapping with a force that shook the walls. But Elvis did not open his arms wide as he usually did. He didn't bask in the worship. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, hands clasped before him, as though surrendering rather than claiming victory. He had broken the pattern. The man who built his legend on movement and noise had conquered the room with stillness. The one called the king had shown himself as vulnerable as the poorest boy in Tupelo. The paradox only deepened the impact. Somewhere near the back, a man whispered to his wife, "I've never seen him like this. It's not a show. It's something else." For Elvis, the moment felt like a weight being lifted. Years of proving, fighting, straining to be heard. All of it released in a single admission. He realized he did not need to erase the past. He only needed to transform it. The orchestra waited, instruments poised. The stage manager gestured from the wings, uncertain whether to resume the set. But Elvis remained still, scanning the crowd as though memorizing the faces. His eyes softened when they returned to the second row. Finally, he spoke again, voice quiet but carried by the microphone into every corner of the hall. "I'm not angry anymore. Those words made me who I am. So tonight, I'm thankful." It was not the kind of statement Las Vegas audiences expected, yet it struck harder than any high note, any pyrotechnic display. Gratitude where bitterness could have lived. Mercy where revenge might have ruled. And in that shift, the barrier broke, not only between him and his old teacher, but between performer and audience, past and present, hurt and healing. Elvis Presley, the man known for his swagger, stood with bowed head as the hall thundered around him. He had given them not just music, but a glimpse into the battle scars of his soul. And by doing so, he had found a kind of peace. The energy in the hall had shifted. What had begun as a glitzy Vegas show no longer resembled entertainment. The audience, still standing, seemed caught between awe and disbelief. Some clapped, some simply held their breath, unwilling to break the spell. Elvis wiped the back of his hand across his brow, the rhinestones on his cuff catching the light, but his eyes stayed fixed somewhere deeper than the glitter. The orchestra waited for his cue. The conductor's hand hovered, uncertain. The band members shifted, exchanging looks. This was not the show they had rehearsed. But Elvis lifted the microphone again, his voice low, almost conversational, as if he were speaking to each person in the room individually. "You know," he began, pausing just long enough to thicken the tension, "I don't hold on to those words with anger anymore. They were heavy, yes, but they made me fight. And tonight, I want to sing not against them, but because of them." A murmur traveled through the hall. People turned their heads again, trying to guess who in the crowd he meant. The second row was alive with whispers, and the teacher sat frozen, her gaze lowered, unable to escape the unspoken recognition. Elvis let the pause stretch, then added, "There's a person here tonight who once told me I had no talent, that I should stop, and I want them to know, this song is for you." The words landed like a thunderclap. The silence afterward was almost unbearable, pressing down on the room. For a split second, it felt as though the entire audience held the same thought. She's here. She's really here. Without another word, Elvis signaled the band. The arrangement that followed was nothing flashy. No brass flourishes, no driving bass. Instead, it began with a gentle piano line, simple, deliberate, almost fragile. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, the spotlight following, shrinking the cavernous hall into something intimate. The song he chose wasn't one of his chart toppers. It wasn't designed to make the crowd scream or to fill the casino with energy. It was a ballad, tender and unguarded, the kind of music he used to hum to himself in the quiet of his childhood bedroom. His voice wrapped around the melody with warmth and ache, carrying every wound, every triumph, every contradiction of his journey. The audience leaned forward unconsciously, caught in the gravity of the moment. Couples clasped hands, strangers wiped their eyes. Even the waitresses stopped mid-step, trays balanced awkwardly as they turned to listen. Elvis's gaze never wavered. He wasn't looking at the glittering chandeliers or the rows of adoring fans. His eyes stayed fixed in one direction, toward the woman whose verdict had once sealed his fate in childhood. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't even a plea. It was steadiness, like a man standing at last on solid ground. The teacher, unable to resist the weight of the stare, finally lifted her eyes. For a brief instant, their gazes locked. The years between them collapsed. No stage, no rhinestones, no fame, no distance. Just a boy and a teacher, revisiting a moment that had never been resolved. His voice swelled on the chorus, not with anger, but with gentleness, as though forgiving her with every note. The lyrics carried no bitterness, only the sense of a man laying down arms he had carried too long. By the second verse, the audience was motionless, suspended in the fragile beauty of it. When the last line fell, the room erupted. The applause was thunderous, but different from the usual frenzy. It was cathartic, as though the audience themselves had been released from something heavy. People shouted his name, others clapped until their hands reddened. But still, Elvis stood quietly at the edge of the stage, chest rising and falling, the microphone lowered. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging not just the fans, but the woman in the second row. It was not mockery. It was recognition, almost gratitude. The crowd sensed it. They knew something larger than music had just taken place. For that night, the Vegas stage was not a showroom. It was a confessional, a conversation across decades. And Elvis Presley, the man the world called a king, had chosen not to conquer with vengeance, but to disarm with acknowledgement. The ballad's final chords still hovered in the smoky air when Elvis stepped forward, closer to the lip of the stage. The spotlight followed, isolating him against the darkness of the showroom. The band held back, waiting. For a long moment, he stood silent, scanning the sea of faces. Then his gaze anchored once more to the second row. The woman there, the teacher, sat rigid, her shoulders tight, her face pale beneath the soft glow of the lights. For most of the evening she had managed to remain composed, but now the walls of restraint collapsed. Her chin quivered, her hands trembled, and then, in front of thousands, she began to cry. Not quietly, not politely, but openly, as if the weight of her own words from decades earlier had come rushing back to crush her. The audience saw. A murmur rippled across the hall, followed by silence, not the expectant hush of entertainment, but the heavy quiet of witnessing something profoundly human. Fans leaned forward, recognizing they were part of a story larger than themselves, something intimate unfolding in plain sight. Elvis didn't move for a moment. He let her reaction speak. Then he raised the microphone again, his voice steady but softer than before. Those words, they cut me once. They followed me. But tonight I understand something. Without that wound, without that fire, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe these songs wouldn't exist. The sentence landed with a gravity that held the crowd captive. It was not bitterness, not accusation. It was revelation, pain, reframed as gift. He paused, letting the idea sink into the listeners, letting them wrestle with it themselves. Many in the room shifted, their own memories stirred, of teachers, parents, bosses, people who had once dismissed them. The show had become personal for everyone present. The spotlight gleamed on his brow as he continued. I carried those words for years, thinking they were chains. But tonight, I see them for what they were, a door I had to push through. The audience erupted in applause, but this time it wasn't wild. It was supportive, almost protective, as though they were standing with him in solidarity. Men who rarely showed emotion wiped their eyes. Women clutched their chests. Some whispered prayers. On stage, Elvis lowered the microphone and closed his eyes. The sound of the crowd washed over him, but he didn't let it distract. He breathed deeply, and when he opened his eyes again, his expression was calm, serene, as though a burden had truly lifted. The teacher's tears flowed freely now. She made no attempt to hide them. People around her turned, some offering tissues, others simply staring, aware they were in the presence of something unforgettable. The barrier between performer and critic, between past and present, had dissolved completely. Elvis took a step closer to the audience, the edge of the stage just inches from his boots. His voice lowered, but carried through the hall with clarity. "I thought those words broke me. But standing here, I know they built me." Gasps rose from the crowd, followed by silence so deep that even the air felt charged. For a moment, it was as though time itself had paused. Then, with no cue from him, the hall rose as one. Thousands stood, not in frenzy, but in reverence. The ovation was thunderous yet strangely tender, like a wave of compassion breaking over the stage. It wasn't just for Elvis. It was for the boy he had been, for the wound he had carried, for the teacher now weeping in the second row, and for everyone in the room who had ever been told they were not enough. He bowed his head slightly, hands resting on the microphone stand, not as a king acknowledging his subjects, but as a man acknowledging his truth. The stage lights dimmed to a softer hue, washing him in gold, and in that glow, Elvis Presley had given them more than music. He had given them the essence of resilience, the lesson that even the sharpest rejection could become the foundation of triumph. The moment belonged not to the casino, not to Las Vegas, but to every soul present who understood what it meant to turn pain into song. The ovation still shook the walls when Elvis stepped closer to the edge of the stage. The light caught his face at an angle that softened the sharpness of his features, revealing not the untouchable figure the world adored, but the man beneath. He raised the microphone again, though he didn't sing at first. His voice carried gently across the hall. "I want that person to know something," he said, his gaze steady, though his chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. "I'm grateful. Because without those words, there would be no fight. And without the fight, there would be no night like this." The hall grew impossibly quiet. Even the waitresses froze mid-step, drinks trembling on their trays. Every ear strained to catch each word. Elvis lifted his right hand, placed it firmly against his chest, and bowed. Not to the thousands standing, but toward one figure in the second row. The meaning was unmistakable. The gesture was not for the masses, not for adulation. It was directed at her. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some craned their necks, desperate to glimpse the woman who had once judged him. Others simply stood motionless, stunned by the humility of the act. What they saw was not a king humbling himself before his court. It was a man laying down the last remnant of bitterness, returning not blame, but honor. The teacher's shoulders shook. She covered her face with trembling hands, overwhelmed. When she lowered them, her eyes glistened, and for the first time that evening, she lifted her chin high, acknowledging the moment, acknowledging him. No words passed between them. They weren't needed. The exchange was visible to all. Elvis turned back to the microphone stand, his hand lingering on it as though drawing strength. Then he signaled to the band. The opening chords rang out, not of a chart-topping rock anthem, not of the fast, driving rhythms the crowd might expect, but of a spiritual hymn. The kind of song sung in small-town churches with wooden pews, the kind of melody that once comforted a boy sitting beside his mother in Tupelo. The hall quieted instantly, reverent as though transformed into a sanctuary. Elvis closed his eyes, and his voice rose, not powerful in volume, but in depth. It was prayerful, weighted with sincerity. Each line seemed less like entertainment and more like offering, a gift extended to the audience, to his past, and to the woman who had once silenced him. The words of the hymn rolled across the room, wrapping it in stillness. People held hands. Some bowed their heads. Many wept openly, no longer concerned with hiding emotion. In that moment, Las Vegas, a city of neon and excess, became a cathedral of forgiveness. As the final verse faded, Elvis let the silence linger. He did not rush to break it. The weight of the song hovered, delicate yet unshakable. Then he lowered the microphone, clasped his hands, and bowed once more. The audience rose again, every single person on their feet. But unlike earlier, the ovation was not frantic. It was solemn, respectful, as though they knew they had witnessed something larger than performance. Elvis straightened slowly, his expression calm. The burden he had carried for decades, the sting of ridicule, the drive to prove, the fear of never being enough, had lifted. In its place was peace. The teacher in the second row dabbed her eyes, no longer from shame alone, but from recognition. Recognition of the man her words had helped shape, though she had never intended it. She clapped softly, almost reverently, her gaze locked on him with a mixture of regret and admiration. For Elvis, it was no longer about victory. It wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about closing a circle, about transforming pain into gratitude. His triumph was not loud, but noble, dignified, unassailable. When the lights dimmed and the curtains finally drew shut, the audience remained standing, reluctant to leave. They knew they had not just seen a concert. They had witnessed reconciliation between past and present, between teacher and student, between pain and healing. And Elvis Presley, walking off stage with his cape trailing behind him, carried himself not as a man still seeking approval, but as one who had found release. The king had conquered not through spectacle, not through vengeance, but through forgiveness. It was a victory no ovation could match.